Today we're going to learn about violence and bullying and harassment in the workplace, and we're fortunate enough to have Michael Howcroft here. Michael Howcroft is with Blake, been our lawyer for many years as far as employment related stuff, but he's got 20 plus years experience in employment standards, human rights, and he's going to help teach us about ensuring that we have a respectful workplace. So anyway, we're very fortunate to have you here, Michael. And as likable and friendly as you are, I wish we didn't talk so often, but from time to time, we have to have some conversations just related to how to manage our people. We want to be able to keep our people safe. We want to be able to protect our business. We want to be able to protect our reputation. So Michael's going to give us a bit of an education on how we can all contribute to a better workplace here. So without any further ado, Michael, I'll pass this over to you, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks. So my name's Mike Howcroft. I am a partner at Blake, Cassels Graydon. I head up the labor and employment group over there. So I deal with these issues sort of on a fairly regular basis, and usually it's a good thing if we don't have to deal with these issues, and if we do have to deal with them, that we deal with them early. So they asked me to come in today and kind of do a bit of a background on respectful workplace training, so that hopefully, if these issues do occasionally pop up, they're minor ones and not serious and don't cause a lot of problems. So to start out, the real purpose of this is you just don't want to be this guy. That's Al Franken. For those of you who are younger than I am, Al Franken was a fairly successful comedy writer and producer at Saturday Night Live. Somehow that made him qualified to become the senator for the great state of Minnesota in the US Senate. And he was having a fairly successful political career, well, until that picture came out. That and some other blowback about what he thought was funny, but maybe other people didn't think was funny, led ultimately to his resignation. And quite frankly, I don't think anyone's heard from him since, right? And it's sort of an emphasis on the fact that these things, what maybe you thought was funny or maybe you thought was innocent can create bigger problems, both for you personally and for the company. So, issues related to, bullying, harassment, and discrimination, I'm going to break that down a little bit as we go through this. They're out there in the world. They can have a significant impact. They have an impact on a business. No business wants to be associated with this kind of behavior. But they also have, an impact on an individual's personal and professional reputation. I have been through bullying and harassment investigations. We've been through, human rights cases dealing with, harassment, in particular sexual harassment. They are awful. They're awful for the person who was impacted, first and foremost. And they have a horrible impact on the employer and a horrible impact on the employees who've been accused of it. So it's really something that you want to try and deal with early and avoid if you possibly can. And the purpose of this presentation is to kind of walk through sort of, I think, what are some of the ground rules and kind of lay out sort of, what is and isn't permissible, and give you some idea of sort of, real world situations to put some thought into. So I'm really going to break the presentation down into two parts. The first part has to do with what I'll call sort of classic harassment. That is protections that arise out of the Human Rights Code. That an individual is entitled to be free from harassment on the basis of really what we call any protected ground. That can be sex, race, religion, physical or mental disability, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, or any other protected class of people that the Human Rights Code protects. Those are sort of the ones that typically where harassment arises. And frankly, most harassment cases arise in the context of sexual harassment. I'll get into that in a little bit more detail. Separate from the protections that exist in our Human Rights Code, WorkSafe BC has also put in place protections under the occupational health and safety regulations that WorkSafe BC controls that require an employer to ensure that they have a workplace that is free of bullying and harassment. So the difference there is that while under the Human Rights Code, the harassment has to be tied back to one of these protected classes. It's got to be sexual harassment or racial harassment, or or the person's being harassed on their religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, whatever that class is. The occupational health and safety rules say it can be about anything. It doesn't have to be about sort of this personal characteristic. It can be any form of sort of bullying and harassing behavior in the workplace. So I'll deal with that sort of in the second part of my presentation. So let's move first to human rights. We are covered by the Human Rights Code, which is the legislation in British Columbia that covers all sort of issues dealing with discrimination and the protection of what we typically call historically disadvantaged groups. The shopping list, such as it is, that the Human Rights Code protects is set out there in the second bullet. Age, race, color, ancestry, place of origin, political belief, religion, marital status, family status, physical or mental disability, sex, which can include pregnancy, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And just to sort of translate that a little bit, gender identity is what someone presents to the world as their gender. Gender is how they see themselves is their gender, and gender expression is how they present that to the rest of the world. And then a conviction of a criminal nature that is unrelated to employment. And as I indicated, in my 25 plus years of doing this, I've seen racial harassment, I've seen religious harassment, I've seen harassment based on sort of sexual orientation, gender identity / gender expression, to lump those all together. But most of it's been sexual harassment, and that tends to be where most of these issues arise. What is discrimination? To define it at its base level, it's where an individual or group is treated differently, and that differential treatment results in a disadvantage to that group. So it doesn't cover, you've often heard of, there's no such thing as reverse discrimination under the code. It's not that if someone's if there's programs to advance sort of the interests of a particular group, it's about sort of a disadvantage. And that different treatment is based on one of the protected grounds I just discussed. In the employment context, it can arise in any aspect of the employment relationship, from hiring, training, compensation, performance and performance management, who gets a promotion, who gets disciplined and how, and ultimately termination. It's important to know that intention, just because you didn't intend to discriminate against someone doesn't necessarily mean that that there isn't a contravention of the code. And I set out there, what I tried to do, a few real world examples of areas that can, you may not necessarily think can be discriminatory, but can create problems in the workplace. So for an example of, a worker who was an Italian background and likes to make jokes kind of related to organized crime and sort of classic Italian stereotypes. The sort of guy who watched too much Sopranos. And maybe over-identifies with Tony Soprano a bit. And does not, and he doesn't think it's a problem because he's Italian. But his behavior and his conduct is offensive to other people of Italian descent in the workplace. That could be a problem. So, it's even though he didn't intend it to be discriminatory, it creates problems for others. A manager doesn't consider a female candidate's job application a male-dominated department because he feels that the applicant will be treated badly by her coworkers. She's being put at a disadvantage. She's not being given the chance to get that work. To avoid an uncomfortable feelings or claims based on sexual harassment, a male manager only invites men on a business trip. And two close friends make jokes about their friend of a different ethnicity, and it's overheard by a third party. These are all kind of examples where maybe there isn't an intention to discriminate, but there can be, it can lead to problems, and we need to think about that. So there's this broad category of discrimination. You can't discriminate. Within that concept of discrimination, there's sort of a subcategory of harassment. And harassment's a form of discrimination, and what the Human Rights Code provides is that every employee has a right to be free from harassment on any protected ground, and in particular, and in particular in sexual harassment, whether that's by their employer, their supervisor, another employee, or someone else who's working in the workspace. What harassment is engaging in a course of vexatious comments or conduct which that person either knew or reasonably ought to have known is unwelcome. Right? So it doesn't have to be that, I made some comments that were perceived as sexist. No one told me they were offended, so it's okay. If there's a objective standard there, that if a reasonable person would have known that those comments could potentially, would have likely been offensive to someone of that particular, that gender or any of the other protected grounds, that's enough to trigger the protections under the Human Rights Code. Usually we look at a course of conduct. In most cases, harassment, in order to be considered harassment, there needs to be more than one incident. It's typically, a pattern of behavior, but it doesn't have to be, right? There is, what I'll call those sort of nuclear options, right? Like, you don't get, if there's not been a course of conduct, but someone engaged in, for example, unwelcome physical touching, right? Which is sort of at the upper end of the spectrum when it comes to sort of what could be considered sexual harassment. There are certain one-strike offenses, so to speak, right? But typically, it's about sort of a course of conduct. And I think that's important because when you look at it practically, and I'm going to get into a little later in the presentation, a little bit around, kind of how do you deal with problems when they come up? Because we hope everyone sort of takes something from this and we avoid problems. But the reality is that human beings are human beings and stuff happens, and sometimes none of us are perfect. And so I'll get into a little bit later about sort of what you do about it if there is a problem. But typically, it can be a course of conduct. It needs to be unwelcome. And I noted earlier, that unwelcome conduct, it doesn't have to be expressed. It doesn't have to be just that, Mike said that was really offensive to my religion or my ethnicity or whatever, my gender or whatever it is. It's that if there's a reasonable standard there, that your conduct is going to be judged sort of on the basis of that. So how do you know if something's unwelcome? First of all, did they complain? Right? Like if someone, tells you that what you've done isn't welcome, well, that kind of ends the analysis a little bit, doesn't it? But there's other subtler clues. Did the employee's expression change? Right? Did you think it was funny and they're very much not laughing? There's, what did their body language say? What was the nature of the conduct at issue? Like, was it a joke? Was it sort of a disciplinary issue? Like, sort of, you look at the whole circumstance around it. And you look at it from the perspective of the recipient, right? Because it's, if this is someone of a particular religion who maybe, not a lot of people of their religion work there, and that you need to look at it from how would they perceive these comments, or, if it's one female employee in a group of sort of 8 male employees at something, and how is that one female employee going to react to sort of maybe some of the conversation that occurred? When it comes specifically to sexual harassment, it can cover a real range of conduct, right? Gender-related comments, remarks, innuendos, verbal abuse, taunting, discussions about an individual's physical characteristics, dress, mannerisms. The nuclear one for me has always been, unwelcome physical contact. Leering, inappropriate staring, that sort of bragging about your sexual prowess. Jokes or comments of a sexual nature. Display of sexually explicit materials. Questions or discussions about people's sex lives. And repeatedly asking someone out on a date. All of that can be perceived as harassing behavior. I don't want to sound like I'm a complete killjoy, but because I think we're all human beings. We all live in a world. We like to have some element of humor, some element of gregariousness within our offices. you know, I can tell you most of my staff tease me fairly mercilessly, and you know, and I occasionally tease them back. But you know, that's part of you know being a good place to work, having a fun work environment. But you know, I think if the one piece of advice I usually give is, if you said, I probably shouldn't say this, but you actually probably shouldn't say it, right? Like there are certain thresholds where you know, if you want to dance in the dangerous territory, you live with the consequences of that, right? So I think, you know, if in your head you know, if in your head there's a twig about, oh, I'm not sure, you know, I'm probably, you know, pushing my luck here, it may not be a bad idea to sort of say, well, maybe I'll just chuckle about that one myself a little bit after the fact, or go home and, you know, share it with my spouse or something, you know, because to say it's just a joke isn't an excuse. Say, oh, I didn't mean any harm, or oh, sorry, I didn't mean to offend you, isn't actually an excuse. Oh, they're just too sensitive is, you know, just a common response that frankly is almost an admission of liability, of guilt. You know, and my all-time favorite, which of course is the I'm not racist, I have lots of friends who are whatever, right? Like that's not an excuse for behavior that, you know, could have been very offensive to someone you're working with. That's discrimination and harassment. And I'm gonna take a few minutes now to talk about bullying, right? Which is the other aspect. And, you know, in my 25 plus years of doing this, you know, where if I would have said in the first half of my career, we saw, you know, there were probably more cases around this classic harassment. I do actually think we as a society have moved forward, you know, but I do think that there's been a shift where people realize that, you know, no, like, you know, Me Too movement happened, you know, there's been more education about sort of issues around respect, and, you know, and I think we live in a much more diverse world, right? We deal with people from different races, different religions, different backgrounds on a regular basis. And I think many of us have come to the conclusion, we recognize that we have to, you know, that we all live in a multifaceted world, and can maneuver through that world a little bit better. So if in the first half of my career, I saw a lot more cases around, you know, I'm being discriminated against. I don't believe, you know, that I'm being hired because of my race. I don't believe, you know, that I'm getting an opportunity for a job because of my gender. You know, I'm not getting hired because I'm gay. You know, those sort of situations simply just don't happen as frequently or as overtly maybe as they used to. What has, I think, come to recognize that there's sort of another aspect of the employment relationship, which is what the occupational health and safety bullying stuff does, which is even if it's not about gender, race, sexual orientation, religion, physical mental disability, whatever that protected ground is, there are also certain ground rules around sort of how people should operate in an office, and that, you know, that's, I would call it that sort of Mean Girls environment, you know, that movie where they sort of all gang up on somebody, that kind of behavior is actually also not appropriate in the workplace. That people have a right to come to the office, to do their job, and without sort of external, unrelated factors around sort of conflict in the office, creating situations that lead to someone, you know, either not being able to do their job, being forced to leave. Like I've seen people actually quit because they were basically bullied, you know, out of a job. And so as a result, the workplace BC in their occupational health and safety requirement requires all employers now to have a bullying and harassment policy. But, you know, it's important to know that that there are policies in place, and so there are ground rules here as well that are important to consider. So what is bullying? And they really use it as a single term. I mean, they call it bullying and harassment, but they don't really distinguish between the two. It's a definition that sort of is defined as one. It is really any inappropriate conduct or comment by a person towards a worker that the person knew or reasonably ought to have known, so again, there's that objective standard, would cause the worker to be humiliated or intimidated. And to me, though, that's kind of, those are the buzzwords, right? Is that, you know, would a person looking at that interaction say, that would have been really humiliating, or that I would have felt really intimidated if that had been me, right? And that's the trigger. Now, of course, work is tough, right? And and not all of us are great every day. Told you're not doing a good job, you get a bad performance review, you're told the project's not good enough. So WorkSafe's been very clear, and has actually been pretty good about making sure they enforce this side of the definition as well, which says that any reasonable action taken by an employer or supervisor related to the management and direction of a worker is not bullying and harassment. So if we look at sort of what kind of things are bullying and harassment, insults, calling someone names. Some of this overlaps obviously with the other human rights stuff. These kind of hazing and initiation practices, vandalizing personal belongings, malicious rumors, social isolation, which is one that I think a lot of people don't think about, but that kind of the silent treatment, like where there's, and I've seen it where there's sort of 5 people in a department, and 4 of them always go for lunch. And there's almost that sort of, intentional exclusionary type behavior. That kind of behavior can be considered to be bullying. Excessive or unjustified criticism, sort of over monitoring work. But more importantly, what is not bullying and harassment are decisions related to job duties, workload, deadlines, transfers, reorganizations, work instructions, feedback, evaluations, performances, discipline, expressing differences of opinion, offering constructive feedback, making a legitimate complaint about someone. None of that is bullying and harassment. I mean, and the way I've often said is, if someone doesn't, there's nothing wrong with saying, look, this wasn't very good, right? Like, this isn't what we expect. You're not meeting the standards. This project needs to be way better. That is entirely within the realm. If it's, why are you so effing stupid and can't do this? Maybe that wasn't the right delivery mechanism, and you're going to have some problems. So it isn't necessarily always about the content. It can be about the sort of how your message gets delivered, right? And if there's a criticism around this law, I think it's been that a lot of employees who are struggling will often sort of, they get very legitimate they get a bad review, they get legitimate feedback, and then their immediate response is, no, I'm being bullied, right? And, and it's not that. And like I said earlier, WorkSafe has actually been pretty quick to say, if this falls within the realm, as long as they'll look at sort of how the message, they don't really look at the message. They'll say, look, no, the employer is absolutely entitled to manage the employment relationship, right? Like, that's part of being at a job, that your boss will tell you, your manager will tell you, are you doing a good job? Are you not doing a good job? What you do well, what you need to improve on, and all of that is entirely appropriate management of an employment relationship. But if it's done in a way, if it's either sort of done with a different intent, right? To sort of, like, why is it okay for 4 people to come in late, but 1 person not to come in late? Those sort of issues, or if it's done in, that doesn't give someone the right to, just scream at you across the desk and throw a stapler at you. Although I haven't seen that in a while. I didn't say I've never seen it. I said I haven't seen it in a while. Everyone has a right to complain about either discrimination or harassment without the threat of reprisal or retaliation, right? Both the Human Rights Code and our occupational health and safety regulations say that if an employee is bringing a bona fide complaint in good faith, that they are entitled to protection for bringing that forward. That employees should not feel that they can't bring an issue forward because they're afraid that it's going to have a negative consequence on their job. So that is both in relation to a good faith report of either discrimination or harassment, being a witness or assisting or providing, assistance in an investigation. All of that is protected, right? So there is, there are, obviously all the policies contain that information, but also, there's a legislative component to that as well. That if there is something that this is that there are the protections in place, and that complaints are investigated. What's an appropriate level of investigation depends on the nature of the complaint, right? But also, and I don't want to overemphasize this, but complaints that are not filed in good faith. So if someone's filed a complaint, and, with an intent to sort of get their, if it's not legitimate, it's not that they're wrong, but it was filed, because they're trying to get their manager, or they're out to get, the other person who's up for promotion or something like that. That is not appropriate and actually can be grounds for discipline, right? But I can tell you in my experience, the number of complaints that I've seen that were actually filed in bad faith are very, very few. It's not, most people aren't going to take that step. They may not be right? And it's not that if an employee says, I think I'm being discriminated against, or I feel I'm being discriminated against, I'm making a complaint, and the investigation determines that in fact the employee was wrong, that the employee wasn't being discriminated against, that they may not have had all the information, or they may not have understood what discrimination is, or whatever it is, that maybe that, when analysis is done, it isn't discrimination. But if the employee made that in good faith, they're entitled to protections. If it's determined that they did that complaint because, they were out to get their manager fired or something, well, then that's not being brought in good faith, and could be a result. It could result in discipline themselves. It really does apply to everyone in the workplace, whether that's, directors, officers, employees, contractors, consultants. If people are working, in the office, they're required to comply with these policies. They're required not to engage in bullying harassment. There is an obligation to report any observed or experienced bullying and harassment, and and obviously to comply with any bullying and harassment policies that are in the workplace. Because one of the issues that a lot of people raise when either they're bringing a complaint because they believe they've been discriminated against, or a bullying and harassment complaint, is like, well, is this going to be confidential? And the answer is generally yes, but not exclusively so, in that there is a process that has to happen, right? So all investigations are kept confidential, right? It's very much on a need-to-know basis. So it's not, there's no it's important that this process maintain a degree of, maybe privacy is maybe even a better word for that, right? That this is about a dispute between these two employees. So but that doesn't mean that you can maintain full confidentiality, because the reality is that there are certain people who just need to know, right? There may be managers who need to know. There's HR that's going to need to get involved and know. And the parties who are involved need to know. Like in some sense, you can't make a complaint again. You can't complain about me as your manager. And part of that process is for someone to come to me and say, Mike, someone believes you've been bullying one of your coworkers, or you've been discriminating against one of your coworkers. As part of procedural fairness in that investigation, I have a right to be able to answer that. I have a right to say, oh, look, no, if the complaint was, I'm bullying, and I said, well, no, I just brought the employee in and told them that, their project was 3 days late, and it looks like, and it only covered half of the issues that I asked them to look at. And, I didn't yell at them. So there may be another side of the story, and as part of the investigation, you have to get the whole story. So, there's no name basis type things. That's not usually possible, but it needs to be kept within the very limited scope of the people who are involved. And frankly, it's important that if you do get involved in an investigation, that you keep it confidential. It is much easier to solve a problem if it does not become a sandstorm in the office, right? So if there was a dispute between a couple employees, maybe an allegation of bullying, maybe an allegation of discrimination, the best thing that can happen is for those parties to see if they can work it out, right? That maybe, we need to figure out what happened, and then we need to figure out sort of what's the solution going forward. And and sometimes that solution is a nuclear option. That the conduct was so severe that the person who conducted that conduct needs to leave the business because their behavior was frankly inconsistent with continued employment. But in many cases, it's not that. And you need to find a way to make sure that the person who was the victim of discrimination or bullying or harassment, those issues are addressed. And if it's not kept confidential, and if suddenly it becomes part of office gossip, solving that problem becomes that much more difficult, right? In the sense that it's because it's not just it's no longer between sort of Mike and Steve, and our dispute is now, that everyone in the accounting department and everyone in payroll and everyone in, management, everyone knows about it, everyone's talking about it, and it just sort of, it can very quickly spiral out of control. So, it really is important that if something like this happens, that when it gets reported early. Because what happens then is that sort of the people responsible for that, whether that's HR or anyone, or safety or whoever, can look into it. It can be addressed. The company can do what it needs to do. It may need to hire an outside investigator. It may need to deal with it internally. All depends on the circumstances. They might call me, and we'll figure out what the best path forward is. And if we can do that and come up with a solution that works for everybody, then hopefully there's some learning on the person who did something wrong. There's some relief and some solution for the person who was on the receiving end of conduct that may have been over the line. And hopefully it means that everyone can actually, continue to work together and continue to have, successful, fruitful careers. And that becomes much more difficult if it's not addressed, or if it sort of gets addressed in a public forum with, half the office talking about it and people taking sides and all the kind of stuff that can sometimes happen. To sort of come up with a couple examples. So, after getting up the courage, Mark finally asks Lena out on a date. Well, I'm gonna pick on people a little bit. Show of hands, who think that's okay or who think that's over the line? Do we think it's okay? Yeah. Who thinks it over the line?
Depending on the position.
Yeah.
Context important.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
This is private secretary. It's not cool.
Yeah. So I think,
So,
first of all, I would say that, we all work a lot of hours, and lots of people find their spouse or the person they're going to spend a significant amount of time with in their life at work. Right? I have lots of colleagues, who appear to have long, successful marriages who met at work. Right? That happens. But tread a little carefully, right? Like it is, inter-office romance is a make-work project for employment lawyers. So it is it's the kind of thing where yes, your point is there a power imbalance, right? It is a reporting. Is there a reporting line, right? Because those are conflict of interest issues that are going to need to be addressed by the workplace, and we have tools to address those. Right? Because it may be that if you're dating someone, that person probably shouldn't be responsible for performance review. If you're sleeping with someone, they probably shouldn't be deciding whether or not you get a raise or not. And those issues can create, and you have to think about, okay, what happens if the relationship, doesn't work out? Because not all of us have the best track record on dating. And think forward on that. The other thing, and it was sort of the example I sort of laid out a little bit earlier, which is, if you ask someone out on a date and they say, sorry, not interested, that's fine. Like that's life. I mean, we've all at some point in our life tried to ask someone out on a date and been shot down, right? And that's not going to cross a line. But if the answer is, well, okay, I just haven't asked them hard enough yet, or I haven't asked them in the right way yet, and suddenly it's either getting it, if you've asked again and again and again and again and again, that's no longer sort of a legitimate, I asked, I thought this person was, I really like this person, I thought it would be a good match. They didn't feel the same way, no hard feelings, we got on with our life. As opposed to, if it's when I've asked on the 6th time, that's harassment, right? That is engaged in behavior that is clearly unwelcome, because if it was welcome, they would have said yes. Client dinner, everyone drank a bit too much. The client put his arm around Max and talked about how sad he was that he wasn't single and 20 years younger, so he could have shown him out, or he could, and take him out for a good time. When Max raised this with his manager, that organized the dinner, the manager said that she could do anything without losing the client, but Max didn't have to go to any further work for that client anymore if he was uncomfortable around the client, and instead the manager put Linda on the file. Because it's a tricky one, right? Because in the balancing act here is, obviously, Max is, the behavior of the client is sort of unwelcome conduct, the arm around the shoulder, kind of, persistence dating, but, there's an issue around, well, okay, but if simply taking Max out of the equation may have an impact on Max's career, in the sense that there's no opportunity to, maybe this is an important client that would help, earn commissions or, develop Max's professional, and he's losing out on opportunities because, of an outside source. So, the issues with external, particularly clients, can be a real tricky one. To me, the solution is sort of not imposing a decision on Max that may have a negative impact on Max's career, but rather to be collaborative about it, to sit down and say, yeah, that's not okay. Obviously, this is our biggest client or something. Let's talk about let's figure out a solution that works for you, that you don't have to do this again, but within the circumstances. So it's I think sometimes it's important not to focus too much on sort of what I'll call top-down thinking, as opposed to sort of making sure that the person who's being impacted by the issue doesn't get to make the final say, but there's consultation and consideration. So, because I think often we just want to jump in and solve a problem. Lawyers are notoriously famous for that, right? And it's really about being able to sit down with this employee and say, okay, yeah, this wasn't okay. One, the company agrees with you. This isn't the kind of behavior. You're not a lamb, being thrown to a bunch of lions. But what do we need? So how do we fix this? And getting employee, maybe that Max is prepared to say, yeah, like I am not, like I'll deal with it, or I will, because there's other issues. Or Max says, yeah, I am more than fine for Linda to take on this file, and I'm going to go do other things. And if I can go work for this other client, that's going to be a perfectly good solution. So Alan regularly compliments Donna's outfits. Alan says things to Donna like, looking good, and if you keep coming to work dressed like that, the guys won't be able to concentrate. It's a little more obvious. Yeah, that's not okay. And I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because I have it touches on another slide at the end, but talking about physical appearance is tricky, right? My general advice is not a great idea particularly if you're talking, but it's all about context, right? In the sense that, and when I'm going to leap ahead to one of my concluding slides, which is not everyone has the same permissions in the workplace, right? So if there's sort of, two female colleagues working together, and a one female colleague says to another female colleague, that's a great dress, I really like your new dress, you look great. That may be perceived one way. Whereas if you have a male colleague saying the same thing to a female colleague, saying, it can suddenly read very much like, I really like your dress, right? Like even if it wasn't the intent, it can be a very different perception. So it doesn't mean that sort of just because a female colleague can comment on someone, oh, you look like you've lost weight, you're doing really great. Whereas, a heterosexual male colleague to a female colleague there's a different potential tone. So I think it's important to be thoughtful about sort of, what you say, who you say it to, and not just how you say it, but how it could be heard, right? Because it may be that it was an entirely innocent comment, but you don't get away with, but it could create problems. Well, looking at another staff member's Facebook page, a number of team members see that the two team members are ridiculing a colleague, saying he is effeminate, walks like a girl, and they don't believe he is really married to a woman. Staff don't do anything about it as the comments were made outside of work. So this one's intended to capture a couple things. Right? One is that, there is, that discrimination can exist even if, for example, this is, I think there's an implication around sexual orientation. You can discriminate against someone on the basis of a perceived sexual orientation. It doesn't actually, you could discriminate against someone because they're, perceived as being gay, for example, even if they're not, right? And that conduct from outside the office made by coworkers can come back to haunt you at the office. Like just because you didn't make a comment, you made a comment at the bar on a Friday night after work and not within the confines of this building doesn't change the complexion of what your obligations are when it comes to how you engage with your coworkers. Things to think about. One is that, a joke only needs to be not funny once to be a problem, right? So I think, I said, I'm not an advocate of saying you shouldn't have, an element of humor and fun in the office, but when you're sort of dipping into territory around someone's, gender, getting into sexual stuff, getting into stuff around an individual's sort of, racial stuff, like, getting into stuff around someone's religion, you are treading into dangerous territory. And, it's very easy to sort of go from, well, I thought that was okay, to suddenly being, oh, that one landed flat. And suddenly, think twice before you go there. Just because someone makes a comment about themselves, you may not have permission to make the same comment back, right? And that is like, some people do choose to be self-deprecating, right? They, lots of people say, well, you go back to the Italian guy who was making, a bunch of jokes about being Italian. You'll get, gay people who may make sort of comments about what it's, oh, that's just a gay thing or something like that. Or, people from particular religion could say, oh, that's a Muslim joke or, something like that. They may have permission to do that because they're a member of that group, but it can be very different, but just because they may be making comments about themselves, maybe in a way to fit in, maybe in a way to sort of deflect some of their own insecurities or whatever it is, it doesn't give you permission to sort of, if you're not a member of that same class, to sort of participate in the same, yeah. For sure, that is exactly what gay people are like, right? Like that's you're sort of treading into territory where you necessarily haven't been given sort of keys to the gate. Just because someone says something doesn't mean you get to say the same thing. Context matters. That was kind of my comment about commenting about someone's dress. That a female coworker can probably say, "Wow," and it's going to be perceived differently than the wow they're going to get from a male coworker. So, you got to think about sort of that context. And just because, you enter a conversation between, say, 3 female coworkers and your male coworker, you don't, that doesn't give you license to sort of fully participate in that conversation to the same degree without potentially getting into some trouble. People will date at work. While it happens, you need to think about it. I would encourage you to think twice about it first, but I also don't want to kill romance. I did once have a client tell me that I hated love because I was concerned that a senior manager was dating his direct subordinate. It turned out that, no, that can actually be a lot of problems, right? So it's not that you can't have inter-office romance. It's not that doesn't happen. And I think it's unrealistic to expect that it won't happen because it will. But how you manage that, it's, being forthright and making sure that, you look at the reporting relationships, you don't, and there's some thought put into sort of, okay, what happens, if things go somewhere else, like not in the direction that you were hoping that relationship turned out to be. I think the biggest one for me is that we all make mistakes, right? No one is perfect. We have all in our lives said things that we have regretted, right? We've all made jokes that landed flat. We've all made a comment that's like, oh God, I wish I hadn't said that, right? So I don't think, hopefully some of this will help, that where, there is that moment of being close to the line. You may say, I'm going to take a step back instead of a step forward, maybe avoid a problem. But, where you do make a mistake, to me, I think the biggest solution for a lot of these problems is dealing with them early and dealing with them effectively, right? Like how you handle, like the mistakes will happen, how you handle the mistakes will determine what happens, right? And I think that's my last point here, which I think a lot of that's about communication, right? Like if you can create an environment where if someone says something that is offensive to someone else, or does something that is objectionable to someone else, that if you can create a culture where the person feels they have rights to say, hey, that's not okay, or that's not funny, or I felt that this was not an inappropriate comment. That was an inappropriate comment, or what you were doing feels like I'm being singled out because of my race or my gender or my disability or whatever it is. That gives you the opportunity. It's so much better if we can deal with those issues directly than have to sort of for it to become a bigger issue. You can create that environment, you will solve problems. I recognize that is not always easy, right? Because when you're coming from what we call a historically disadvantaged group, that may be very hard to speak up. The flip side of it is for the person on the other side, if something does come up, to also own your mistakes, right? Like I think too often we get, where I see the problems is where people get entrenched. And they're like, oh, I didn't, they're being too sensitive. I don't know what, they can't take a joke. Well, it doesn't matter, right? What your intention was. If you engaged in behavior that caused someone else to be upset, own it. You don't have to, you could just say, like an apology will get you very, very far, right? To say, I'm sorry, that wasn't my intention. If I offended you, I'm sorry, I didn't, like, that solves, I am amazed how often when I am at the Human Rights Tribunal doing a mandatory mediation after spending thousands and thousands of dollars on a case, and employees have left the company because of it all, how often obviously there's money involved in a dispute at that level, but how often the thing that actually gets that matter resolved is an apology. But it really is, think about what you're doing, get that, and so, try to avoid the mistakes up front if you can. And if you can't, and you do make a mistake, and look, we all do, if you can, the sooner you own it and the sooner you sort of don't get entrenched in sort of who's right and who's wrong, and focus more on what the impact of that behavior had on the other person, to see if we can all, because we all just want to come to work, do our jobs, succeed, make some money, and live good lives. And to the extent that there was something that made it harder for someone else to do, let's just try and fix that and get it sorted and be able to, so that we all can continue. And if on those rare occasions where someone, does cross a line so far that's not possible, then we always have to deal with it in a different way. But I think, in my experience, the vast majority of cases and conflicts can be dealt with by people just getting together and, thinking about what they're doing up front, and then addressing it quickly and respectfully to each other when it's done. So I probably should have paid more attention to my clock while I was chatting, but if you give a lawyer a mic, they will continue to talk.